So it looks like we have a sequel on our hands, folks. That's right. We're following up the 2007 masterpiece. So is this one as good, if not better than the first one? Let's find out. No, it's not. No, no, I didn't want people to think that, I left any kind of ambiguity in that sense. But let's get into the actual album review now. Colors 2 by Between the Buried and Me. So Between the Buried and Me doesn't really need an introduction at this point. I'm going to give a little bit of one for anybody that's not initiated. So Between the Buried and Me is a US tech death metal progressive rock band. They really hit the ground running when they first came out in the early 2000s with their self-titled work. Got some pretty good recognition with the follow-up of The Silent Circus, but really it was their third album that broke them into more of a critical acclaim with Alaska. They were blending the kind of death metal, tech metal of the time with more of a progressive rock, proggy outfit. It wasn't just blow down the doors, balls to the walls, everything at 11 for the entire runtime of their tracks. They took some time to really develop songs, blending different genres and trying different things. The follow-up to Alaska in 2007 was the masterpiece of Colors. I mean, honestly, there's no other way to say it. Colors just took what Alaska started and cranked everything up to 11. So we have a lot longer stretches of music. The entire album is a little bit of a concept album in being kind of one piece of music that's subdivided into 8 different chapters. This has some of the staple Between the Buried and Me tracks, such as Ants of the Sky and White Walls. What followed it up with The Great Misdirect, which is probably my favorite record from them. Again, they went full prog on this one and then followed it up even more so with an even more Goliath of a project of The Parallax Part 2. From there, it kind of wavered a little bit, if I'm being perfectly honest. Coma Eclectic and Automata 1 and 2 were serviceable. Like, it was still good music. They were still putting out some really interesting blends of music, but it never reached those same kind of heights that the 3-album punch of Colors, The Great Misdirect, and The Parallax Part 2 did. So now we come to Colors Part 2, or I guess Colors 2, and with this album, it's very, very dense. Like, my boy is thick on this album. It's a spiritual successor of Colors, because Colors, as I mentioned, is a little bit of a concept album in that it's one long track that's subdivided into these 8 different chapters that kind of take on different vignettes of stories or concepts or themes. So it was really interesting to kind of follow that up because it's not a full story or narrative concept album like Parallax, Coma Eclectic, or Automata. So it was interesting that they chose this album to follow it up. It's not surprising. It's probably their most popular and most well-known album of their entire discography. So in that sense, it's not necessarily a narrative continuation of whatever story they were laying down, because there really isn't a story on Colors, but it is a spiritual successor in that sense. It is one long stretch of music without any divides in it, very similar to how Parallax and Coma Eclectic kind of structured their albums. But within this one, it is much more of a singular piece of music that runs for just over an hour's worth of music. The difference, though, is instead of 8 tracks, we now have 12, and there's a lot more smaller chunks that we've subdivided tracks into. And sometimes this works in providing a little bit more of a digestible chunk, but sometimes, for me, honestly, it takes some of the enjoyment out of it, because one of the things that made Colors very, very special was the longer stretches of music that build into an amazing crescendo. And on this one, we only have, 2 tracks that are over 10 minutes, and only 2 other tracks that are over 6. This album also is a spiritual successor in a lot of the homages to the original. There's a lot of moments in here that kind of harken back to the original in terms of the music, in terms of the lyrics, although they're also taking some of the lyrics from other pieces as well. Like, there's a few points on here where they're taking stuff from Parallax, specifically the day in, day out, that's Layer Goes to Rest from the Parallax, but also a lot of the different soundscapes and specifically the synthesizers that we felt with Coma Eclectic. So they're almost taking everything that they've learned since Colors and then recontextualizing it and putting it into context of a Colors album. And I want to take a moment right now before I get too far into this to just praise Tommy's singing styles. I mean, Tommy now has, almost 20 years of singing with this band, and his voice, especially with the growls and the singing, it hasn't wavered. Like, there's still a lot of moments on here that I'm like, okay, it's starting to feel a little bit wear and tear. It's not quite as gritty. It's not quite as bombastic. It's not quite as, like, sinking your teeth into. But it kind of feels like Michael Eichelfeld from Opeth singing styles on, say, Ghost Reservoirs or Watershed, where, my man, what are you doing? Laps around the neighborhood? Jeez. All right, getting back. It's a little bit more refined. It's a little bit more polished. And I know that can take away some of the edge from a lot of those singing styles, especially within the growls when it is a little bit more on the polished side. It's not quite as raw. It's not quite as rough. But it does serve the music very, very well. Dusty Warning and Paul Wagner on the guitars, they're still able to shred and chug and do their beautiful mastercraft thing. But talking a little bit about the lack of crescendos, I am also feeling a little bit of a lack of, I guess, meaty guitar solos on here. Like, there's not a whole lot to really, really sink your teeth into. It's not through lack of trying. There's a lot of moments on this album where you can feel that the boys are definitely trying to emulate those high moments that were from Colors, but it never really reaches that to that same extent, and I wonder if it's because it's the lack of the build-up, and maybe it's also a little bit of the lack of the padding. But I also want to really showcase Dan Briggs on the bass. His bass is extremely chunky on this. It's very potent. It's very forefront. There's a lot of moments where it's not just in the background and he's just following along whatever Paul or Dusty is putting down. He has his own personality on this, and there's a lot of moments where he's really able to shine. But I really think that the star performer on this is obviously Blake Richardson on the drums. There are so many moments on here that it astounds me that the man is still able to keep the time that he's setting down. And especially on, I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but of that first single that they released, which was Fix the Error, his drumming style on this, where he's just able to open up and just unleash himself, was brilliant and beautiful. I love so many of those ridiculous playing styles that he's able to do, and this is seen throughout the album as well. So coming into some of the tracks proper, the album opens up perfectly with Monochrome, and I love how they're able to open up pretty much all their albums just stellarly. This is one thing that I love about Between the Buried and Me. Opening and closing the album, they know exactly what they're doing. And I love with Monochrome how it has this 3 phases of it. It opens up with just Tommy on the keyboard singing it out. That then builds into a very gentle crescendo where Dusty and Paul come in on the guitars. That then builds even further, which allows Tommy and Blake to unleash themselves. So Blake is just hammering it out on the drums, and Tommy is able to extremely begin to growl, sing, and scream on that. And then from there, it bleeds straight into the double helix of Extinction, which reminds me of the opening pieces of the original Colors. It's paired very well, so there's almost a mirror to those first 2 tracks. I don't feel as though the double helix of Extinction is as good as those 2. It still has that unrelenting, beast of a track. It's very metal. It's the teeth that we're lacking from Automata and the Coma Eclectic series. I also love how they're able to then shift gears entirely when we come to Revolution in Limbo and just be quirky. That was one of the things that I loved from Ants of the Sky, where it becomes this jig section. So in Revolution in Limbo, it almost feels like a calypso beginning to come on there. And it shows the band is able to dip their toes into so many different styles without losing the through line. So on the Revolution in Limbo, it's so quirky, it's so strange, it turns a whole 180 degrees without losing the drive, without losing the beat. Then we come in to Fix the Error, and I've already mentioned how much I love Blake's playing styles on this. His ability to just lay down such crazy drum work on this. And who doesn't love a good cowbell? I'm pretty sure they were in the studio being like, fellas, I gotta have more cowbell, baby. All right, so I'm sitting here editing the video and I realized that I forgot to talk about all the guest drummers that we had on Fix the Error, like Mike Portnoy from, well, he used to be Dream Theater. Who doesn't know Mike Portnoy at this time? But also Ken Schlack from Kandarian, I think it is. Candaria. And Naveen Corporize, formerly from Animals as Leaders. And each one brings a new dynamic to the song. Each one has their own spin on it. And then it comes back to Blake, and it really showcases each individual's own preference of drumming style. But it also, again, shines a light on what Blake is bringing to the table, because his addition on this, even though he's, the star performer of most of the tracks on this, his masters of the drums are just fantastic. And again, we go right into one of the more lengthier tracks, which is Never Seen and Future Shock. And this is one of the things that I really particularly enjoy about this album, is that much like Colors, the original, my favorite moments on those albums were some of the more somber and less like bombastic moments, and that can be definitely seen on this. With Never Seen and Future Shock, I love how this track resolves, and this was one of those build up and payoffs that I was really hoping for, and so this got me really excited for the rest of the album, because it starts off very bombastic, very rough, very hard hitting, and then it goes into this amazingly soothing aspect with Future Shock, and I drip with joy when I come into that, and then it bleeds into probably my favorite moment on this, which is Stare Into the Abyss. Stare Into the Abyss, especially that first half of the track, is so beautiful and brilliant, and Between the Buried and Me is so brilliant and amazing at constructing these motions of music. Not only is it very somber and mellow, but it also has this incredible drive to it. It's so heavy and so hard-hitting that I can't help but be moved. By the time we get into the second half of that and into Prehistory, it does kind of fall a little bit flat, especially with how high that plateau was. And Prehistory does a lot of that same thing that Revolution and Limbo did, with being quirky, with being fun. I love the little sound effects that are in it, with like those cartoon sounds, like the whoop, 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 woo kind of an idea. I was almost expecting a Wilhelm scream, but it never really got to that point. Honestly, from there, like Bad Habits, The Future is Behind Us, and Turbulent, these three tracks don't do a whole lot for me. There's no real big crescendo like we had with Stare Into the Abyss. There's no big chunky or really hard-hitting moment that we had from the double helix of Extinction. But these three tracks still aren't without merit. Like Bad Habits has a brilliant dueling of guitars and keyboards between Tommy and Paul and Dusty, and I feel as though this is some of the more raw moments that we had from Coma Eclectic, especially with the sound of the synthesizers backing it up, and it's a really interesting soundscapes. And the same can also be said about The Future is Behind Us, especially with that doon 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 doon. Like, it feels very much like a Coma Eclectic in that sense. But I mean, one thing that I will say is I do enjoy the build of this track, and I love where the song crescendos in that sense. It's not quite to the same extent that Stare Into the Abyss was, but it is probably the best moment of music since then. And I really love how it really blossoms into something very, very special. And The Future is Behind Us does end on one of the more hard-hitting moments on the album. It's meaty. It's reminding me of some of the more hard-hitting moments from the prequel to the sequel or White Walls. It never really gets to that level, but it still does allow for very interesting, just sinking the teeth into a very heavy moment of music. And then when we come in Turbulent, it essentially does the same thing, if I'm being perfectly honest. It still has that rhythm style of that dun 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 dun. And I almost wish that they combined those two tracks of The Future is Behind Us and Turbulence into one track, so that we've got more of like about 11, 12 minutes worth of music that is really able to open up and really explore the space, instead of being two chapters of around 5 minutes that feels a little bit more constrained. So I still love the music that's set around it. I'm just wondering if the framing system that they used and the mode that they presented the music was limiting their amount of exploration within the music. And then we come into the final 2 tracks of Stamfanto, which is basically just a little bit of an interlude. And then we come into the Big Goliath, the 15-minute track of Human is Hell, another one with love. And, man, this might be one of the more... This is probably my biggest gripe about the album, is that where the original Colors ended with White Walls, the best track off of that album. I mean, no offense, Ants of the Sky, but really it had the most hard-hitting moment where it was like the white walls, right? And then that play out where that guitar play out on that track is so brilliant and so beautiful. When we come to Human is Hell, another one with love, we never really get to that same point. What it does do, though, is it does summarize the album very well, but at no point do I feel that same kind of drive, that same kind of investment that I had. Because this is one of the longer tracks, it is able to explore the space, and it does do that very well. There are moments on here that have some brilliant builds on it, some beautiful payoffs, but I also don't really feel as though any of those payoffs are really well warranted with the amount of buildup that was invested into them. I still enjoy those playouts. I still enjoy where that track goes. But I think the biggest fault of this is that it ends the same way that the Parallax Part 2 did, where the song kind of builds itself up, and then stops, like on a pure cliff. And then we have about like a minute or so of a guitar solo to end it all off with. And it took all of the drive that we had to build itself up and essentially cut it off at the legs. And we have this torso that's trying its best to get to the finish line, but all that momentum is gone. And it leaves that guitar solo, which really is a beautiful guitar solo, but it leaves it very on its own and lacking in any of the emotion that was preceding it. So it did kind of cut it off at its legs, and it did kind of end with a whimper rather than a bang. But, I mean, when this is the lowest part of the album, that really has to say something. It's just a shame that that's how the album finished, you know? Like, I was really hoping for a big powerhouse finishing, because the boys know how to finish an album. All of their other albums up to this point had finished on such a beautiful high note, including the Parallax, which I'm not a big fan of how they finished it, but still, you know, that's my own little gripe. I'm still on that same message here. In the end, this album is still a brilliant and beautiful album. And honestly, I think the biggest fault is that it's a successor of Colors. Had they used a lot of these same songs and music, but deviated itself from the Colors so that everybody's not comparing the two, because you're never going to be able, I mean, I don't want to say never is never, but like, it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult to reach those same heights that Colors, like the original Colors, did. I think what this did do is it provide a great framing reference for this album for them to then grow from. So I think that if they did what a similar band did this year, which was Transatlantic, where originally they were going to do Whirlwind Part 2, but instead use the Whirlwind as a framing reference for where the album was going to go, I think we might have had a better, like, finished product, because I wouldn't be sitting here the entire time comparing it to Colors, right? So I think that was both an advantage for a framing reference, but also a disadvantage because I'm always going to be comparing it to that. With that being said, it still has some of the best music the band has put out, probably since the Parallax. It's streets ahead in terms of innovation, in terms of metal, in terms of blending different genres, and it showcases some of the best music that the band has done in pretty much a decade. So I can't I'll fault it for that. And I will be honest, this past 2 weeks, we've been inundated with a hell of a lot of new releases. Death Haven, the Neil Morse Band, Leprous, and this one probably is my favorite out of the bunch. So that really does go to something when those albums I also thoroughly enjoyed. In the end, Colors Part 2, it emulates and is a spiritual successor for the original, but it never really reaches that same grand height. There is so much density to this album, very similar to the original, that it will take a lot of listens to get into, which is part of the reason why I'm putting it out almost a week after it's been released. and I still have so much more to discover. In the end, I will say that Colors 2 by Between the Buried and Me is one that I will absolutely pick up in physical format. It deserves to be on the shelf behind me. That's kind of where I'm at for Colors Part 2 or Colors 2 from Between the Buried and Me. What do you guys think about this album? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've left a link down below. Even $1 a month does go a long way. You get your name at the end credits, and depending on your subscription amount, you get music reviews or live streams or other fun perks. So yeah, consider that. Also, check out my podcast of Quid Prog Quo. The last episode that I put out is out now. It was with my cousin Kyle. We talked about King Crimson and Queens of the Stone Age. So it was a really good time. You should go and check it out. And that's about it. So thank you so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.